When did the Americans and the British realize that the Soviet Union would stand up to the attacks of the Wehrmacht? At the beginning of World War II, the Western Allies, including Britain and the United States, were confident that the Soviet Union would not be able to withstand the blows of the Wehrmacht. Few believed that the Red Army would last long, and many predicted its surrender in a matter of weeks. However, despite skepticism and fears, by the end of 1941, the situation began to change. In this video, we will tell you how the opinion of the Allies changed, how they began to believe in the ability of the USSR to stand up, and how the victories at Moscow and Stalingrad radically changed the course of the war. In the summer of 1941, it was widely believed in both Britain and the United States that the Soviet Union would not be able to withstand the blows of the Wehrmacht. Forecasts predicted that the Red Army would not last more than a few months, and maybe even weeks. Under these conditions, the first months of the Great Patriotic War became a time of observation and analysis for the Western Allies. Many believed that sending financial aid to the USSR was a hopeless task. The argument was simple. A German victory seemed inevitable, and if the Wehrmacht prevailed, the equipment sent to the Soviet Union would simply disappear. This was reminiscent of the situation with British supplies to Russia during the Civil War, when many of the shipped goods eventually fell into the hands of the Reds. Nevertheless, the British began to realize in the summer of 1941 that the German forces were not advancing as fast as expected, and the losses of the Wehrmacht were increasing significantly. Winston Churchill, realizing that Germany was facing difficulties, recalled the lessons of the First World War. He hoped that the Soviet Union would be able to hold off the German offensive for a long time, pulling back a significant number of German forces. Churchill noted that while the Soviet Union was fighting, it was not so important where exactly the front line was, emphasizing the strategic importance of prolonging the war. This approach has been adopted in the UK and the USA. The bet was made that while the Germans would be bogged down in Russia, the Anglo-Americans would be able to prepare for a full-fledged entry into the war. They were building up their forces in aviation and preparing for a decisive offensive, which was supposed to be not just a blow, but a real fiery ram capable of turning the tide of the war. Until December 1941, before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States of America remained formally neutral regarding World War II. Nevertheless, the United States actively helped Britain by providing it with the necessary resources and weapons. The First Moscow Conference, which took place from September 29th to October 1st, 1941, became an important stage in strengthening Allied relations. This event actually became the starting point for the formation of the anti-Hitler coalition, which included the USSR, the United States, and Great Britain. However, even at that moment, the Anglo-Americans were not sure that the Soviet Union would be able to withstand the onslaught of the Wehrmacht. Forecasts in the West were still extremely pessimistic. It was believed that the USSR would last no more than a few months, and many analysts predicted that the Red Army would not be able to resist until the onset of winter, 1941. The scale of foreign aid to the Soviet Union in 1941 was very limited. Despite this, every contribution, even a modest one, was important. For example, British Valentine tanks supplied to the USSR played a role in the battle for Moscow, which showed the value of this assistance. However, despite the fact that the deadlines previously indicated by Western analysts, from 3 to 6 weeks, had already passed, there was still little optimism in the West. Forecasts remained skeptical, and even at the most successful moments of the war, such as during the battle for Moscow, Western leaders continued to doubt the possibility of long-term resistance by the Soviet Union. At that time, the West often drew parallels between the Soviet Union and China in the context of the war with militaristic Japan. China, despite huge losses and territorial losses, continued to resist, pulling back significant forces of the Japanese divisions. A similar role in 1941 was attributed to the USSR, which despite heavy defeats and the offensive of the Wehrmacht, continued to fight. In October 1941, the American Department of Military Planning at the U.S. Department of Defense, despite the assistance that the Soviet Union had already received, concluded that the defeat of the USSR was predictable. Churchill also held pessimistic views, believing that the Soviet Union was on its last legs. During this period, when the Wehrmacht was approaching Moscow, even in Soviet circles, there was no complete confidence that the capital would be able to be held. However, it was at this moment, when the situation seemed almost hopeless, that something unexpected happened: the Soviet counteroffensive. This counteroffensive, which opened up new prospects for the Soviet army, was a decisive turn in the war. Therefore, many historians really consider the Battle for Moscow to be the beginning of a radical turning point during the Great Patriotic War. It was from this moment that it became clear that Germany, despite all its successes, would not be able to defeat the USSR, and the war entered a new, more equal phase. Although many are inclined to believe that Stalingrad was the decisive moment during the war, the Battle for Moscow also turned out to be a key episode, especially from a foreign policy point of view. Although this was periodically forgotten in the West later, it was the defeat of the Germans near Moscow in 1941 that changed a lot. At this point, the Soviet Union began to be perceived as a force capable not only of slowing down and delaying the German offensive, but also of delivering a decisive blow to the Germans. It's interesting how quickly analysts' forecasts have changed. Previously, the Soviet Union was given only weeks to resist, but after the Moscow counteroffensive, the Allies began to make much more optimistic predictions. But if the Soviet leadership initially considered 1942 as a period for the complete defeat of Germany, then confidence in the victory of the USSR was growing in the West. In January 1942, the Americans officially recognized that the blitzkrieg that had captured Europe had been completely thwarted. The British, in turn, began to think seriously about the possible final victory of the Soviet Union. In London, it was believed that in 1942, the Red Army would be able to dislodge the Germans from Soviet territories. And naturally, proposals to improve relations with the USSR began to arrive from both sides. However, it is important to note that those who were on the ground in the USSR understood the situation much more realistically and were less optimistic. For example, Frank Noel Mason McFarlane, the head of the British military mission in Moscow, was well aware of how difficult and tense the situation remained, despite the successes of the Red Army. He was much more cautious and critical of the predictions of an imminent victory. Frank Noel Mason McFarlane, while at the front, came to certain conclusions. He admitted that the Red Army had won, but the successes had been difficult for the Soviet side. And in the future, the Germans could well take revenge. In the spring of 1942, in his opinion, it was too early to think about the defeat of the Wehrmacht, since the Red Army was still experiencing significant logistical difficulties. The new failures of the Soviet Union in 1942 and the German offensive on the Volga and the Caucasus once again caused a flurry of deep concern in the West. The British, although they retained hope for the survival of the USSR, thought that it would last until the winter of 1942 to 1943. While the Americans began to seriously consider the possibility of a separate peace with Germany, given the dubious prospects of Soviet resistance, interestingly, the Brest Peace Operation of 1918 continued to be remembered by the French and other Western military leaders when it came to the Soviet Union. For many in the West, the USSR remained an unreliable partner whose capabilities were in question. This view was reinforced by the fact that in 1940, France surrendered to the mercy of the Germans, without exhausting all means of resistance, while not forgetting to blame the British for this. By 1942, both the British and the Americans openly admitted that they were not yet ready to fight the Germans on a wide land front. Nevertheless, the Soviet counteroffensives, both near Moscow and Stalingrad, came as a real surprise to the Anglo-Americans. These successes of the Red Army, which literally overturned the forecasts of the Western Allies, demonstrated that the USSR was not only able to repel attacks, but also to launch a counteroffensive, which significantly changed the strategic picture of the war. According to the British Embassy in the USSR, 1943 was a turning point not only on the Soviet-German front, but also in relations between the USSR and its allies. Analysts in the West continued to claim that Stalin is running out of tanks, and there are only a few months left of divisions, believing that the Soviet Union was not ready for large-scale offensive operations. However, from 1941 to 1942, there was a significant evolution of consciousness. The Soviet-German front was no longer perceived as a front that was only stalling for time and began to be seen as a key element in the overall picture of the war. This change in perception played an important role in strengthening relations between the USSR and its Western allies, which in turn led to the strengthening of Lend-Lease and the creation of an image of the friendly USSR, which was actively supported by the media, including Hollywood. An important point in this evolution of perception is, of course, Stalingrad. At the turn of 1942 to 1943, questions about how long the USSR would last finally disappeared. The victory of the Red Army at Stalingrad not only repelled the powerful offensive of the Wehrmacht, but also marked the beginning of a radical turning point in the war. It was during this period that it became obvious that the Soviet Union had not only survived, but was also capable of successful offensive actions, which radically changed the strategic situation on the Eastern Front and led to new, more positive forecasts from the Allies. For a long time, there was concern in the West about a possible new German offensive and the conflict spilling over into a positional war. But over time, beliefs have changed. As a result, everyone came to believe that the Soviet Union would stand. One should not sneer at the pessimism of Western intelligence services because from their point of view, any country that found itself under such powerful blows would not be able not only to withstand them, but also to go on the offensive. That is why in 4 years, British analysts have gone from claiming that the USSR will last a few weeks to believing that the Red Army is the most powerful army in the world. This turn in perception was truly drastic. In addition, it is worth noting an important observation. Since 1942, the Western Allies clearly understood that it was the USSR that was bearing the brunt of the Wehrmacht. During the entire Second World War, the USSR lost almost 30 million people. Western countries considered their efforts, including Lend-Lease and actions in North Africa, to be only supportive measures that helped, but were not key in the context of winning the war. Friends, that's what the video turned out to be. And what do you think about this?